My name is Paul Giobbi. For those of you who don't know me, I am the Chief Coronavirus Officer these days. Like many of you, I find myself consumed with things I don't normally do, collecting AR that's more sensitive, working with the Small Business Administration, and continue to just marvel at the highs and lows that come each day in this new market. Luckily today the Dow was up 7 points the last time I checked, so that's a whopping 0.018%. So at least we're not seeing the swings of 10 or plus percent one way or the other. Anyways, given the circumstances of what's going on in our work environment these days, we didn't want to do a traditional webinar where it was a one-way feed of information. We don't want to push any products for sale. It seems totally inappropriate in this climate, in this market. And we want to do things that are adding value to your world as a MultiValue shop or developer. And mostly we are trying our hardest to stoke conversation and interaction, and wherever possible, we're trying to do it with face-to-face video. So on that note, a couple of weeks ago, we hosted an experiment in the UK called an Isolation Imbibe, and we all got together over a Teams link and just had a beer and connected with folks. There was no agenda. It was an awful lot of fun, and we have decided to do 2 of these in America, North America, next week. One on April 21st, one on the 23rd. You can register at pickmultivalue.com/imbibe. I know it'll be an encouragement to you. You'll see some faces you haven't seen in a while, and have some fun conversation. And I'll look forward to seeing you there. But before I turn it over to Pete, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of the future of MultiValue, specifically this convergence of the young developer meeting the classic MultiValue developer. And today you're going to hear from Pete Schellenbach, whom you all know and love, but you're also going to hear from Mike Wright, who's a 30-something, modern full-stack developer that inherited the D3 system. And those 2 worlds converging are pretty important right now. The younger developers, if you don't already have interaction with them, they're talking about containers, version control, Docker, automated deployment. They usually refer to themselves as a full stack developer. And of course, they want to put a new UI on your PIC system, whether it's web or mobile. And they spend a lot of their time writing APIs or REST services. That is the future for this market, whether it's comfortable language for you or not. Those are the type of developers that are coming in to take over these systems. Our thesis is that these applications are so durable and so customized that they're going to last much longer than the developer base. So our whole mission is really to prepare these systems for the modern developer outlook. And that means doing things like we're doing now, which is putting people and community first before profits. This market has been subjected to a lack of innovation and price increases for far too long. And that's a big part of why we're doing what we're doing. So you're not going to hear any product pitches here today, but you are going to hear about this kind of fusion of the DevOps revolution and MultiValue and how they're coming together, the convergence of the young and I'll call it the mature, right? The Mike and the Pete. You're already seeing this in your operation, and we're going to talk in terms with this VS Code integration that are going to appeal to that generation. So I encourage you to have fun. We had a fantastic engagement at our first event. Everybody stuck around. We did a lot of video and audio interaction, and I hope you'll plan to turn on your video at the end of this and participate so we can see your face and be encouraged. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pete Schellenbach, and look forward to having an engaging conversation with you guys. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. I'm sure most of you guys most of you guys know me from being in this market forever. So we're here to talk about AccuTerm, Visual Studio Code, and the WED Editor. And if you've been using the WED Editor, well, let me go back a bit. The WED Editor was an awesome tool. I mean, it's been around for, I don't know, 10, 15 years now. And I loved it. people that have been using it love it. It's just a great tool. We've over the I don't know, several years, we've been finding things that people wanted in a IDE or an editor that we just didn't have in the WED editor. And we were looking at how are we going to add these things on? What's it going to take to modernize it, add things like IntelliSense and snippets and things like that people have been asking for. And a couple of years ago, Visual Studio Code kind of came on the radar, and it seemed to have an awful lot of good things going for it. So we started looking into it. Mike Wright did a little research and found that as of last year, 50% of developers are using it as their IDE. So it was like, well, we should really look at this. About 2 years ago at the Spectrum conference in Florida, a group of MultiValue developers and vendors and whatever, a pretty nice little group, got together and decided to form a little user, committee on what we can do with MultiValue to make it relevant and keep it going. And one of the topics that came up that was really top was an IDE for PIC. Shortly after that, there was a lot of chatter on the news groups about different IDEs, using Notepad++ or Sublime Text or Visual Studio Code and what we could do. And the OnGroup kind of came in there and said, we've kind of done this. So we got together with the MV OnGroup around the Spectrum last year in Phoenix and kind of joined forces. OnGroup decided that they would make their development tool open source. And that was the beginning of the MV Connections group and the MV Basic extension that's on GitHub now, which is an open source project now. Very, very cool thing. Nice that we had the collaboration between the vendors. And at the time that came out, the only way that you could really use it with a PIC database was either to have your files in a local file system like in Windows, or to use a gateway connection, and it was a little bit clumsy. So the idea is that AccuTerm is everywhere, and people are using AccuTerm with the WED editor. So we already have a nice connection back into the PIC file system. So why not connect that to the Visual Studio Code? And now we get the best of both worlds, right? We get all of the PIC goodies that we're used to that we had with the WED editor, and we get all of the modern development tools with Visual Studio Code. So that's kind of the genesis of this. And over the last several months this year, I've been working on that connector for AccuTerm to Visual Studio Code, which we're going to do some actual live demos with in a little bit. So right now I want to turn it over to Mike to talk about where this all has come from, and then we'll get into some live demos.
Awesome. Thanks, Pete. Hi, everyone. If we haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, Mike Wright, Director of Technology here at Zumasys. I look forward to the future opportunity of connecting up with each and every one of you and getting to know you better. If we have met, it's nice to be talking again. This slide right here, just some high notes on how to go about getting started with this. Obviously, a big thing here are the updates to AccuTerm. So we're supporting AccuTerm 8 and AccuTerm 7 with these updates. For AccuTerm 8, you just need to be on the latest version, which is 8.0.1020. And for AccuTerm 7, there's an add-on because we're not doing new version releases for AccuTerm 7 anymore. So there's a separate add-on installer that'll give you the connector and the host program bits. It's really important if you want to use this that you go download either of those things, depending on which version you're on, and install them on your system. And then make sure you update your host programs, because that's going to unlock the VS Code command from TCL and the connectivity bits that Pete has baked into this that will allow you to launch VS Code from AccuTerm the same way you've grown used to launching the WED editor from AccuTerm. Obviously, then you need to have VS Code installed as well separately. So we've got a download link for that. You should have the MV Basic extension for VS Code, which you can get directly through VS Code once it's installed. They've got a little extensions panel there, or you can go to the marketplace that Microsoft has online and install it that way. And we've also posted a link for the getting started with all this, the documentation from the perspective of the extension. So that walks you through that. That specific link is for connectivity option 2 here, which is AccuTerm. Option 1 is the aforementioned MV gateway that Pete was talking about a minute ago. So there's all that. The extension, just to give a note on it, does a lot more than just facilitating the other side of the connectivity. So it's not just the receiver for AccuTerm's bits. It also provides a linter and IntelliSense and all these advanced language features that Pete mentioned as a reason for why we chose to go this direction rather than try to port all of those things into the WED editor. Right? Why reinvent the wheel? Right? When you have a free, open source, accessible, and widely adopted IDE out in the marketplace already, like VS Code, it made more sense to jump on board with that. Before we get into the demos, we'll do our quick call to action here. So we're really excited to be showing you this stuff today. We're very passionate about all of these projects. In particular, I think it's really cool to have an open source project now for the community to get involved in. So when you walk away from this today, we want you to go ahead and install the AccuTerm updates, get the host program updates in, try out VS Code. Maybe you're new to VS Code, maybe you've been using it elsewhere, and it'll just be a new experience to have it tied into AccuTerm. We don't really care where you're at in terms of how much of any of these things you've leveraged, so much as we want the more people involved, the better, to foster that sense of community. So if you have any issues with respect to the AccuTerm side of it, don't hesitate to send an email to support@zumasys.com. Let us know about it. Whatever relevant information you can give, that's helpful. If it's an issue that's specific to the extension side of things, user experience stuff on the extension in VS Code, that sort of a thing, there's all kinds of opportunity to provide feedback for the extension or help out over there. There's a link to the contribution guidelines right there. There's a link to the issues at the bottom of the page. So if you're simply reporting an issue, you can go there and do that. But we want people to try to get involved on the open source side of this as much as possible. So the contribution guide will outline, anything from reporting bugs or making feature requests to helping to write documentation, to triaging other people's issues, to writing code. We're open to all kinds of help. There's really no wrong way to get involved in an open source project. It's all about, everybody coming together to put time towards it. To that end, here's a little snapshot at some of the stuff we have in the pipeline. So if you're on the MV On version of things, you have remote debugging available already with the MV Gateway, but that's it. There's no other support for remote debugging at the moment. So Martin's hard at work at providing that functionality for OpenQM, and when that's done, we'll be porting it over to JBASE. We're also working on dynamic syntax highlighting, so getting the color coding and keyword identification and stuff honed in to be based off of specific languages. There's some gaps in there that we'll talk about right now. Essentially, those things are all the MV On version at the moment. The IntelliSense is now dynamic, so that's unique, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. There's some configuration options for the AccuTerm connector to make that a more seamless experience. So Pete's working on that, and we'll have those updates forthcoming to give you more control over things from the AccuTerm side. You'll see in a few how it really does a lot of legwork for you to scaffold out the environment, which is quite nice, the workspace as it's called. We'll have some hooks in there for custom compile and catalog commands, so you'll be able to modify those things the same as you can for WED right now. We'll have some updates for visualizations for sub-value and value marks. So when you're looking at pick data, if you want to inspect pick data from the VS Code side, to have some nice clean displays there to help you out, just as you're used to getting with WED. And yeah, like I mentioned, there's, if you want to get involved and you're kind of ready to dive in, go check out the issues page of the repo. We tend to tag things that we feel are good and accessible and up for grabs for the community as help wanted. So you can go through that list and peek at those, and they should be smaller, more bite-sized type things to get your feet wet and get involved. With that, I'll kick it back over to Pete, and we'll start the live demos.
All right, thank you, Mike. Let me see if I can get this onto my screen here. And let me know if you can see that, Mike.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, cool. All right, so this is AccuTerm 8, which I'm sure many of you have tried. If not, you should. And it's similar to AccuTerm 7, a lot of the same features, and that's why we decided we should make this available for both 7 and 8. I mean, it's a great feature. The innards of the AccuTerm are pretty much already there to do it with. So here we go. I have a couple of connections open here. This one is to a D3 Linux machine in our lab. And that's what I'm going to start with. Then I'll do a little demo on Universe so you can, just see what the differences are, which are pretty much not, which is the cool thing. So you were used to in the past just doing WED, file name, item name, right? So we're just going to change that up a little bit and do VS Code, file name, and then item name. And let's do, we could do another item. And basically, this is going to launch VS Code. It's going to set up the AccuTerm server side, and it's going to launch a little middle program that connects the two together. So the idea is to be as seamless as we are with the WED editor and give you the same kind of comfort level with that. So you don't have to do a lot of special configuration. It just becomes pretty much automatic. Visual Studio Code is driven by this concept of a workspace, and the VS Code command from AccuTerm builds a workspace for you on the fly and connects up to it. And I'm hoping that this will connect. It says it's not able to connect. This is not good. So maybe we'll start from Universe.
Let's start from Universe. There's a shortcoming on the D3 side, which is a good call to action for the community, and that is that we don't have a language definition contributed yet for D3. We have MVon, which was in there at the start. We have JBASE and OpenQM, which our team has contributed now over the last few months. And we also have a contribution for Universe that came from a community member, Jeff Teeter. Unfortunately, Rocket wasn't willing to put any time or effort towards the project. So that means, as the Universe one has a need for work, or as someone would like to leverage all of this for D3, it may fall to community members, power users maybe in the space, to fill in for some of those gaps as they appear. So when Pete's in for his Universe example, so he can show you how the IntelliSense bit works there. Connectivity works for D3, so don't get me wrong on that. Just since that part didn't work here, give you a brief overview of some of the other pitfalls you would run into with D3.
Yep. Yeah. The D3 worked fine in our last webinar, so it's kind of weird that it failed this time. But so this is what it looks like basically. I mean, you start from a command line. You can see back there, it starts up the server mode, loads the document up, and behind the scenes, there's this thing called a workspace that's already built for you. Auto opens your files. It has a file browser on the left side, which is, the WED editor, you did a file open. Here it's a little browser tool that's part of Visual Studio Code. It's populated with the files that are available from your MD or your Voc in the account that you're running it from, just like pretty much exactly like within the WED editor. If I want to open a different file, I just click on it and pops up. And this, again, Mike said this is a preference. If you double click it, it sticks, and if you single click it, it's like temporary. So if I've got this one up and then I click another one, it replaces the first one. Because this is Universe, we should be getting IntelliSense on our keywords. Like I just put my cursor over print and it's showing me what is print. These keywords have been customized for the platform, right, Mike? This is what Jeff Teeter had worked on.
This is correct, yeah. And you take care of plumbing that setting appropriately when you launch things from the VS Code or the AccuTerm side, so that the user doesn't have to go in and change these settings. You know what platform, you know where they're coming from. So
yeah, let's look at those settings. Right. Go ahead.
I was going to say, again, keep in mind, we currently support MVon, JBASE, OpenQM, and Universe. So if you're on any other type of system, your default is going to be MVon, since that's what the foundation of this was. So if you start to observe any gaps there, it becomes an area of opportunity to maybe get involved and help fill in for a language definition for that flavor you're using.
So I mentioned before that the VS Code command from the PIC side builds this workspace for you, and that is what controls the way Visual Studio Code sees PIC and how it works with the language. So this is the MV Basic workspace in a flavor that is easy to edit, a nice user-friendly flavor. You can see here our language type is Universe. And that was set up automatically for us because the PIC program, the VS Code program on PIC, knows it's for Universe, so is able to plug in the language field there. This is driven by a JSON record, which you actually can edit in PIC. There's a template for this record, and the VS Code command reads that template and then fills in things like what account I'm running from and if my file system is case sensitive. There are things here that users can customize. One of the one that keeps coming up recently is this maximum items. This controls how many things are returned from the file system when VS Code's asking for the contents of a directory or a contents basic. What it thinks is a directory, we think of as a PIC file. It's set there at an arbitrary number just to keep things from getting crazy. Because if you were to like open this in a file that had a lot of records, this is a data file, you might end up opening a file that had 1 million records in it. You don't want to sit here and wait for 1 million records to download. It's just crazy. So there's a limit there to keep things sane. We found people have sometimes a lot more files or records that they want to work with, and an error shows up often next to the file tree up here saying you can't resolve it. It's usually because this number is not big enough. You can edit that back in PIC. This is you see, this looks pretty much the same as this because they came from the same place. This is what AccuTerm starts with, and it fills in those things that are in the pointy brackets as part of building out this template. So you're free to edit this to change some of your settings. This is one of the areas that we're planning to make a little more user-friendly and move the common settings into a separate configuration record, and then you will not ever have to use this, but it'll be there if you need it. So that's kind of what's controlling how Visual Studio Code interacts with PIC and how it knows what language to use to do your syntax highlighting, the IntelliSense, which is where you hover over and we get a and we have to tell it we're editing, where we get our definition of the commands. And it also so one of the things that is nice about these new modern IDEs is something called a linter, which looks at your code and tells you where it thinks you may have made mistakes. So just for the fun of it, let's see if I can just create a new program, and we'll just watch the linter in action. It's just a real simple thing. And it does take a few seconds, the communications back and forth to create this and open it up. And it will open in just a moment.
Yeah, if you're wondering too, you're just thinking back to Pete spawned this by saying VS Code samples and then specific records. But he got much more when it opened up and loaded the Solution Explorer. It's because we're not really doing anything right now to limit what is sent over as far as an automated discovery and open process. It's pretty liberal with what it'll go after. Really the big control that's in place is that max items number. There was a separate configuration that you may or may not have seen in there on files to exclude. So that's an option right now if you wanted to pare back how aggressively it is or aggressively it does open other files in the system. We'll be looking to improve that too, and then bring some controls and security restrictions around that forward so that it's driven at a layer even beyond the workspace, because the workspace is still something that the user can control and edit. And you might have cases where administratively you need to block access to certain things, even from certain development resources. So look for changes there too. That's the difference right now compared to the WED, right? When you open things via the WED, you're not getting a solution explorer on the side panel that's automatically running through and discovering other files in your environment.
That's right. Okay, so we have our new program started here, and I'm just going to do a really stupid, simple program. You can see that my first statement is underlined in red. If I put my cursor over it, it'll tell us why it's underlined in red, because I don't have a next statement. So it's watching the format of my program and telling me things about where I might want to take a look and fix things. And the IntelliSense here is telling me that next needs a variable name after it. You can see that little drop down there. So I'll say next I, and I don't want any of those extras. And now all the little red lines went away because the linter says, oh yeah, that's a legitimate program. So we can just continue on. So I'm just going to write a bad statement here, just for the fun of it. It doesn't recognize that this doesn't work, but the compiler will, and that's another interesting thing that we could do here. So let me save this program. I just press Control S to save, or I can use File Save if I want to do that. Okay, so it's saved. I right-click, and there are my MB Basic commands that are built in, and there's compile a program. So this is similar to what you have in the WED Editor, although we have it on a toolbar in the WED Editor. Here we have it as a right-click. So I'll right-click and say compile it, and that'll open up a new output window at the bottom of the screen. You can see there where it's showing me what was the result of my compilation. You can see in this case it says that this is not a good statement. Now, in the D3 and QM and JBASE versions of the host programs, the routine that actually does the compilation is able to parse the output and look for errors and build a link here. When we get to the QM demo, I can show that. And the link then would let you click from the error line in the output window, and it'll bring you back to the statement that had the error in it. So again, that is something that's on the PIC side, and we haven't finished the universe and Unidata pieces for that yet, but they're coming. Okay, so what else do we want to talk about here? We did compiler errors. We looked at the templates. The file browsing.
Do you want me to jump in and do the JBASE demo?
Yeah, let's do the JBASE demo.
Sure. Let me know if you can see that okay.
Yep, beautiful.
Awesome. Okay, so I've got JBASE running on Windows here locally. I've got this AccuTerm session connected to it already. It's JBASE 576, which is latest. We'll have some updates coming soon for JBASE, but I'll leave that as just an aside from here because we're not here to talk about JBASE. What I need to do basically from here is the same thing Pete did. To spawn VS Code. So I've got some sample stuff in this demos account from a Vue.js and REST API demonstration I've done previously. So I'm just going to open up one of those API programs, issue that command, and it'll start working to spin up that VS Code instance. Need to pull that window over from my other monitor. So a big thing about the extension, the MV Basic side of this, is again the fact that we've taken what was originally focused on MV and we've started to extend it out towards other languages. And so when you think about areas and opportunities for community contributions here, I think a big chunk of that's really going to be helping to fill in gaps, targeting specific flavors. With the latest update 2.0.4 for the extension, we built in that configuration for the language type, so you can specify your flavor if it's one of the 4 that we have definitions for right now and get IntelliSense for that. What we don't have yet that I mentioned that's still on the docket to do is implement the dynamic syntax highlighting. So the way VS Code and these extensions do IntelliSense and syntax highlighting and just general pattern matching with regular expressions to parse your code and figure out what's a variable, what's a command, all that stuff. There's kind of 3 different layers there, and it's the first layer for the IntelliSense that now can dynamically flip. There's the other 2 layers that need to be made dynamically flippable. And then I think as people start to use those definitions and identify areas of need, there'll be opportunities to continue to improve all of that stuff. So I get the benefit here from an IntelliSense perspective of I'm using JBASE, which we had one of the support resources for JBASE go through the docs and really build out a feature complete language definition here. So few and far between are the JBASE type things that you're going to see undocumented as you're using this with JBASE. That same opportunity is going to be there to, if that experience is not there today for whatever flavor you're running, the opportunity to help get the MV Basic extension, that project, to that place of being feature complete for your flavor, opportunity for everybody to get involved, I think. You can see here where the syntax highlighting, like I'm getting IntelliSense just fine on these statements, but syntax highlighting of a variable name, it's not really dialed into what we have going on here. And so it's highlighting status because it sees that's a keyword, but it's not recognizing it's part of this variable name. That stuff is all still work in progress. And the extension right now, again, is just using the default pattern matches and all of that from the MV on Sharp version. We do have contributions for new regular expressions for Universe and JBASE and OpenQM, but one of the things on my plate is to allow those to dynamically flip here inside the extension. So it's just worth calling out as we're talking about using this with different flavors. That should logically follow, I think. You're talking about a vehicle now for interacting with many different systems. So of course, a lot of the legwork behind it will have to go into whatever needs to be customized about the interaction with each of those different flavors of systems. So that's that. But the other nice thing too, just to extend on the linting bit a little bit, is this API program has some subs in it. So if I start commenting that out, I get some pretty immediate highlighting in VS Code of the fact that I've got a problem in this program now that the language extension is reporting. And if I pull my little console drawer up, I can see in this problems tab that it's reporting, hey, you're trying to make a go-to or go sub for a label that's not defined. And I can click on it and jump straight to those areas. And you can see, just as Pete had some red underlining on on his thing, I think, yeah, you showed off with your for next loop. Yes. We get the same thing here. So if I undo that, just Control Z it to undo that change, you can see the linter very quickly realized this all resolves now. I'm okay. Those problems go away and aren't reported. Similarly, if, let's see. I'm gonna go the other way too. If I comment out this go sub to get all records, I get a warning back that I have a label down here that's not actually referenced anywhere. So you note that this is not being reported as an error. This will still be okay, but it's worth calling attention to because perhaps the label's not necessary anymore, right? Or some other action should be, some attention should be called to it. So it's kind of nice to recognize the linter can report on warnings and errors, treat them differently. You get yellow for a warning, red for an error. This ties into an easy and I think nice area of opportunity for improvement to the linter, and a reason why linters are so important now, and every programming language out there is really taking steps to provide one for the development environment. It's an opportunity to catch errors before you get to runtime. And a lot of the time, at least from what I found, you end up chasing and fixing things that are being reported at runtime. And some of them, in theory, we should be able to start to extract out and target and fix before we get there. And if you think about what's happening here for the linter, it's basically parsing all of the source code here and identifying what the labels are and how the labels are being used. And in that way, in theory, it should be possible to have it parse the source, identify all the variables, and identify how the variables are being used, and give you warnings on things like, hey, you've got a variable that you're trying to use that hasn't been assigned, so let's avoid the VNav here. Go ahead and get it defined, and not have to wait for runtime basically for that to pop and trigger a warning to you when you're monitoring your runtime errors. Similarly, maybe you defined a variable and then never used it. Kind of like this label. Theoretically, it should be possible to extend the linter part of the extension to start to provide feedback like that. And that's where this thing gets really critical and kind of exciting, is those are the things that start to speak towards new development resources, right? You start to simplify their path to getting up to speed and working in these environments. And you put more tools in your tool belt too to help you become more efficient at your time working in the environment. So it just becomes a win-win kind of a thing for all parties involved. I'm going to uncomment that change. Come back over here. There's another thing too that is a bit we need to rectify within the AccuTerm connector, and that's the whole concept of a right-click, like go to definition or peek definition. Right now, if I right-click, try to peek that definition, this load is going to fail. It's making the wrong REST call back to the system to get the incorrect item back to give me the preview of it. I can show you this working from the extensions perspective with a local copy of this code. If I right-click it here, do my peek definition, you can see it's resolving that in this other folder and finding it and loading it up just fine. So this is a real handy thing too. The WED had something similar. You could double click into things and automatically open up those records and all of that. And VS Code really does that and then some, with the ability to right click go to is your jump into the document. But right click peek is kind of nice, because if you're just looking for a small thing, maybe you don't want to clutter your workspace by opening up document after document. That's a thing we kind of have an inroad on fixing here, so we'll expect to patch that up and ship an update to the AccuTerm side of it to take advantage of that feature. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on with all of it. I think that's all I had for JBASE. Pete, you want to kick it back over for QM?
Sure, let's go back. Let me know when you can see that. See the screen?
Looking
okay.
Good. Yep.
Okay, good. Okay, so we're back. This time I'm on a QM connection, and I did while Mike was talking, I did look at that D3 thing, and I had two different sessions running, and they were confused, and that's probably what was causing it to be unhappy. So anyway, now we're on QM, and at least they should be able to demonstrate the error reporting that comes back and being able to click on an error line. So we're opening up this little sample program. And the Universe machine was a lab machine running in our VPN. The QM instance is actually a local copy of QM running on the same machine. So it'll work either way. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so we got a little subroutine here. And let's go and make a problem in it, save it, and then try and compile it. And this should pop open our little output window and show us what happened during the compilation. And we can see that it failed compiling and that it's on line 3 And we have this little link here. This is what we didn't have on the D3 system. I'm sorry, on the Universe system. If I control-click the link, it goes right to the line where the error is. So I can go fix it, save it, and then try and compile it again, and we'll see we have no error the second time. And successful compile this time. So all of our output, just very similar to what the WED Editor had in the little output window. The WED Editor would pretty much let you double-click any number and find a line number based on that. This is a little bit different in that the line numbers have to be identified back on the host machine as opposed to in VS Code itself. So there is a little subroutine that parses the compile output, looks for errors, and builds, basically just says what lines they occur on. That's all the VS Code needs is the line number. That code has been ported for QM, JBASE, and D3 at this point, but we have not done the U2 versions of it. It's just a basic subroutine. So I think someone is working on it, and if not, that's another call to action. We could always use a little help with some of these things. So as we try to get more and more platforms involved. Let's see, what else do we want to show on the QM? I think that's pretty much it, right? I think we should open for questions, right?
Yeah, I think so. If I wax philosophical for a second about any of it, it's again just to stress that, you know, a big area in need is going to be as we're targeting specific flavors and in certain circumstances, right? We're involved. We're happy to be here. OnGroup is involved. Happy to be here. You'll see like first tier support of all of this stuff and a level of involvement from our resources. In other instances, it might take more of a community-led engagement to fill in some of those gaps. So we really could use a power D3 user right now who'd be willing to spend some time and do the language definition there. That'd be a great opportunity to get involved. Similarly, if you're out there and you love regular expressions, we could use somebody probably putting, you know, a month's worth of time in total into shoring up regular expressions everywhere. Save me the trouble. That'd be great. So, you know, we're not short of opportunities for involvement. And I think that's ultimately why we're so excited about this, is because it's really presenting an opportunity for everybody out there in the multi-value space to come get involved on a project related to multi-value that has good visibility within the community. And it also starts to bridge the gap between the multi-value community space and the greater development community at large, right? We're using the same editor that people in other environments are using. We're working on an open source project that exists on GitHub next to a ton of other open source projects, right? We start to break down some of those walled gardens that we have and really expose, you know, who we are and what we do to the outside world, and have a tie-in or an inroad really for net new development resources too. It's an exciting thing.
I know one thing I was thinking that I should demonstrate, and that's how the REST API works, just as a point of information. So the file system provider that's part of this MV Basic extension is using a REST API for accessing the server's files. The gateway has a flavor of that API that it supports, and what we did with AccuTerm is wrote a little socket server that sits between VS Code and AccuTerm and performs that function. I think what I can kill the one I'm running now and then just bring one up in another command window, and you can actually see the API at work when we're doing things. So this is just a command prompt, and I'm going to start the little server running in this window so you can actually see it in debug mode. And we'll go back to Visual Studio Code, reconnect to our server. And as it does that, you can actually see the API functions going into from Visual Studio Code through the connector back to AccuTerm, and then getting data from AccuTerm and feeding it back into Visual Studio Code. So at this point, it's probably about done with its back and forth thing. But if I open another record here, you can watch that record coming through here again. And this is an open REST API spec, and anybody that felt like it could write a connector themselves to connect to any other PIC machine, or for that matter, anything that had files on it that you wanted to browse. And that basically supplies all of the browsing functionality that we're seeing here. And the file reads and writes, creates, renames. Some things we don't let you do just because AccuTerm doesn't allow things like creating files. You can create programs, but you can't create like new folders. So just thought it would be interesting to show how that's working behind the scenes.
Yeah, and I'd point out too that because the baseline here was the MV Sharp developer extension, and that shipped with the MV Gateway connector, which is also from the OnGroup to start off with. There's that .msi package inside. That was what facilitated the remote connectivity from that version of the extension to an MV Sharp environment. That still is here today, and along the way of the MV Basic conversation, Grant and that team revised it to implement the same REST API. So speaking exactly to what Pete was saying, the fact that you have two connector options here now to use with the extension, and the fact that they use the same REST API, the REST file system API, to describe and can work with the remote PIC system, it's really, the idea was to set the foundation for anyone if they had a specific need or a passion about a connector behaving a certain way or implemented a certain way, right? There's an opportunity to extend things out and create a connector that respects that same REST API to facilitate connectivity through something else. Obviously, we love AccuTerm, we love the WED, we love Pete, and as he mentioned early on, he was looking at the need to improve the WED. So we had a lot of reasons to provide a connector via AccuTerm, that we're happy to allow people to use to get connected up into the extension. But it also allowed him selfishly to set the groundwork for the future of WED, right? Which we believe VS Code to be.
Hey, Mike, we've got a question coming from Corbin Taylor in the UK, and since it's almost 10 o'clock over there, I guess we can move him to the front of the line. Do you want to restate the question?
Yeah, so it's generally speaking a question surrounding using source control here, and the reality, what you'd need to use Git. VS Code understands Git, so the MV Basic extension doesn't really need to do anything to unlock Git from a PIC perspective. VS Code is there; it does Git straight out of the box. That part's okay. What you really need then is, if you're going to abstract all of your source control up into Git and switch to like a remote development mode, you need to make sure that your PIC server has a clone of that repository, basically, that it has Git installed and that it can pull and push and do things that way through it. It should all layer in pretty handily. If you've tried and you've run into some issues there with the connector, we definitely want to hear about it. It's a thing where, every shop's kind of in a different space here with respect to how they're doing version control and how far down that path they've gone. There's some D3 shops, for instance, that are fully into GitHub and have webhooks that are doing the syncing and everything of code going two ways. So their developers are all local and remote and pushing up to this GitHub repo over there, and it's communicating to their D3 server over here. Everybody's kind of in a different place, but you shouldn't have any major obstacles here if you can have Git on your PIC server and can clone the repo and start there. That gives you the capacity to separate your source and your source control from your system of record and to start to do all these other things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the one issue I ran into really was regarding, was it gets distributed. So obviously each developer would be required to have a copy of their own QMs on their own system. Is that correct? And then synchronization probably becomes a problem then. That's the issue we was running into. Don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
We do have like developer licensing and personal edition licensing for QM. The dev licensing might be appropriate there, where you can have local QM instances at the fingertips of each of those devs. They're running Git, they're cloning the repo locally, they're working with that repo against their local QM system. So in that way, you don't necessarily need the AccuTerm connector to facilitate a remote connection to your main QM system over here. You've got people in their own local sandboxes already. You could still use the AccuTerm connector locally to pop back and forth between the two, especially since QM's a virtual operating system that does help it to understand the file system and all that. In theory, you shouldn't run into any major roadblocks there, just depending on how the whole thing is laid out. It's something that if we want to maybe schedule some time as a follow-up and dive into a little bit more, what you're driving towards is absolutely, before I joined Zumasys back in 2018, when I was managing a D3 shop myself, that's absolutely what I was trying to drive towards. And that was a big reason why I was moving from D3 to JBASE, was to facilitate the same kind of remote development experience and to break down the requirement of having the devs connected into, a server room product or production or dev box, that I was centralizing. I wanted them in their own sandboxes. So it's all possible. It'd be great to peek at that a little bit further with you.
Yeah. If we could get something set up for sometime in the future, that would be really appreciative. Definitely.
You don't want to go till midnight?
No, we've got work tomorrow.
I think Tim had a question next about AccuTerm GUI syntax in VS Code.
Okay, so we don't have actually any special hooks in the VS Code connection or the MV Basic extension for doing GUI development. It is something that is that we've chatted about a few times, and we'll probably figure something out eventually. But right now, it's mainly for editing the source code and not the actual GUI design projects themselves. But it is something we might be able to do.
Well, if you've got the, sorry, I was going to say, if you've got the JED up instead of WED, if you're in there, will there be a facility to hop to Visual Studio Code to actually do the managing of the actual code inside of, because you've got the whole of the structure thing that happens with the GUI side, which structures your program for you.
Yes.
To actually then allow that to be done inside of Visual VS Code would kind of really bring the things together.
At this point, it's something we haven't been able to do. Part of it is that the WED editor is in Windows a COM object, like a component object model, and Visual Studio Code is not, and that is the technology that the GUI design process uses to stuff data into the WED editor. So that's another hurdle to try to solve. It's not just a file system.
I've got plenty of hurdles for you.
Yeah.
all of my stuff that I now develop is in the AccuTerm GUI side. And consequently, I'd actually almost like AccuTerm to quietly almost disappear from the screen entirely, so that actually it's just a conduit. As far as they're concerned, it's just a Windows system with a GUI interface. They don't know it's actually not. It's actually all driven in what people call a legacy system, an old system, as a PIC system.
Exactly. That's how we want it to be, right?
Yeah, for years.
Yeah, that is something that we're looking at, and it might end up being the other way around, where we have a version of the GUI designer we can do in Visual Studio Code, as opposed to making the current designer.
Works for me. half the stuff I do is in Visual Studio, because I've got using like Dev Express and stuff like that. Love to be able to join the two together in some fashion at some point. That would be even more wonderful.
So would we.
Yeah, that's going to take a little while, I think.
Okay, so next, Joseph has a question regarding record locking.
You want to do that, Mike, or you want me to?
Sorry, I was jumping ahead and filling in some context for some stuff in chat that David asked. The record locking thing. So Joseph is saying that he's just running into a couple things trying this against Universe, and he's noticing the records aren't being locked. I would say, and this also relates to what I just told David, Pete and I have been cheating a little bit here today. We're running advanced copies of MV Basic 2.0.5. So there's a formatting thing that I pushed an improvement on the other day. Pete has a couple tweaks in there too to do with logging and how the file system was interacting. So we're expecting to ship 2.0.5 on the MV Basic side, probably Monday. It'd be tonight if tomorrow weren't Friday, but don't push stuff to prod coming up on Friday, right? So we'll probably kick that back and do a little bit more testing this week. And he also has some updates for the AccuTerm connector side too. I don't know that any of these things specifically address what you're bumping into, Joseph. It's possible that we've got some overlap here between the record locking thing and then an issue with getting the IntelliSense and compiling to return anything. The only thing that comes to mind in there for IntelliSense is that sometimes VS Code won't trigger IntelliSense and the language server until it sees the record open for editing. So you may have to just throw a space in there and take it out to force it to context flip, and then you'll see IntelliSense loaded in. It doesn't seem to be happening with my JBASE stuff, but we're seeing it happen in other circumstances. So it's an acknowledged issue at this point that we need to find a way to tell the language server just to turn on right away, not wait for any sort of edit mode to get triggered. That would solve for that bit. I can't speak to the record locking side. That's a little curious.
So the record locking is not enabled for the Visual Studio Code connector. And that's kind of by design because we're using a REST interface, and REST is stateless, supposedly. And if it's stateless, then what do you do with a locked record? So technically, we could do it the same way we're doing it with WED because we do actually have a process on the back end that is persistent, but it wouldn't probably work with any other connector technology. So at this point, we just decided to leave it unlocked records.
Yeah, and that plays nicely too with what Corbin was talking about in more of a distributed environment anyway, where you start to break away from that record locking model because now everybody's in their own sandbox. The REST reasons make total sense there too. Corbin's also asking if they can save the session or workspace. So Pete, right now, you use that template to spawn the new workspace each time. Corbin, if you wanted to standardize that workspace, you'd have to modify the record. It's a JSON record stored in PIC and the AccuTerm control file that the host program set up. This is it on the screen here. I think as we improve the experience surrounding that, there may be a capacity to say, you know what, instead of respawning it based off this template each time, let's roll something like, hey, we've created an existing, right? We've got a history here, so let's launch based off that, and then it wouldn't be creating a net new each time.
Yeah.
The problem is that there's a session identifier that links the VS Code editing session with the AccuTerm server session. And that's different in each instance. Yeah.
If you've used the remote connectivity extensions that Microsoft provided for VS Code, there's like a remote Docker, remote SSH, remote WSL, if you're doing anything in the Windows subsystem for Linux. You kind of notice a similar sort of behavior, except there you're launching it from your local VS Code. Here we're launching things from the server, theoretically, because we're already terminaled into the server. But it sort of goes through this launch and respawn process as it stands up an instance of VS Code on the server and then downloads all its bits and then reloads the environment and gets you up and running. So I think, I leveraged that quite a lot, honestly, especially before we had the AccuTerm connector ready to go. So we'll be paying close eye towards how they continue to improve that process, because I think we'll have some takeaways we can bring over into this world too, just to make it more seamless when you are connected to a remote system.
Cool. Yeah, sounds good.
There was a comment on the IntelliSense for AccuTerm GUI stuff. I should note that for the IntelliSense for JBASE, we don't have IntelliSense in place for all of the dynamic object stuff yet. That's going to be a big area of opportunity for improvement that we'll probably own. I wouldn't necessarily have that as a call to action for the community, but it's a good footnote. If you're a JBASE user and you're using dynamic objects heavily, you're not going to see all of that in the IntelliSense experience for JBASE so far, but that's on our short list of things to get to as well.
We have a little bit of work still ahead of us.
It's ready enough to ship and start using, but it's by no means feature complete. It's pretty good though.
So I'm curious for other attendees who haven't chimed in, if you're willing to turn on your audio or video, just get your kind of your more non-technical feedback on our direction, what you think, and any advice you'd have for us as a company.
I like the way it's going because it's definitely feeding the market is in the way out there for the people. You come out of university, they have no idea about PIC, and until we can actually introduce PIC into an environment they are so comfortable with, but not just as an editor, but the whole of the rest of the sort of Visual Studios type features, which means that they just know what they're doing with it, rather than us actually going, oh, you've got to know a complete. You've got the text here, but that's as far as it goes, which is kind of looking back to where PIC came from 30 years ago. What we need to move it to is that environment which says, yeah, those are the words that actually is the syntax for what you're dealing with, but you're actually dealing more with visual type objects type environment, which they're all used to.
Yep.
Yep, we do have some work to do there, don't we?
Oh yeah, I'm not saying there's no way I think this is an easy task.
So as Mike mentioned, one of the things that is happening right now is the idea of the debugger, right? So Visual Studio Code has a built-in debugging tool and a standard protocol to talk to a debugger. And Martin Phillips is working on the QM debug adapter on QM right now, so that we'll be able to run and debug programs and set breakpoints and look at variables right in the IDE. So that just makes the whole thing so much more seamless.
Yeah, that's ideal for me, because in most of my work now is on OpenQM. I'm pretty much moving the whole of my user base over to OpenQM.
So you'll be one of the first ones to use this.
Awesome.
If I can, yeah. Well, Martin only lives just up the road. He's only 12 miles away from me.
I like that you stated it in miles, not kilometers. Thanks for the conversion for us.
I don't work. The UK doesn't work in kilometers. It works in miles. Where do you think you got it from?
Is that where we got feet from too?
You can tell I just spent all my time on the tubes when I was in London. I wasn't driving around paying attention to any of that. So there you go.
Yeah, everything's in miles an hour.
Yeah. There's a nice thing about this too, just to call back to a few other things that I think are relevant. All the language definition stuff and the language definition files are JSON files. That's standard fare stuff now in this day and age. The language like syntax definition files are JSON with regular expression patterns specified. That stuff is relevant here for how VS Code does language stuff. It's also relevant for other things out there, like if you're looking at documentation online and seeing syntax highlighting and code samples, all those libraries, or most of them, the major ones at least, use the same kind of language specs to define all of that stuff. And so we've got another project we're pushing on our documentation side internally, not related to the extension, where it's going to greatly benefit us to have syntax definitions in place for how to highlight JBASE code for online code samples for JBASE, and then QM too. So shoring that up here gives immediate benefit for that project, and it also creates that exposure point now, because what we've done is gone ahead and brought, the platforms that do the highlighting themselves are open for language contributions themselves. So to get like JBASE or OpenQM on the language list and these other things now is another opportunity to break down that wall surrounding MultiValue and get it out into the general text space, which I think is cool. The other thing too, with all the debugging stuff, is the protocol that VS Code uses is this debug adapter protocol that's not specific to VS Code. Visual Studio proper uses it. I think, if I remember right, Eclipse was even on the list. There's a bunch of different editors that all implement their debugger using that protocol, which means in theory, by doing the work to bring that protocol to QM, JBASE, and if other vendors decided to do the same thing to introduce support, Envion has done it. that debugger, that remote debugging capacity, if people ever moved on from VS Code, as long as the other editor that came up and became like a mainstay was using that same protocol, that just lifts and shifts right over. So I wouldn't want anyone to think we're marrying ourselves here to VS Code necessarily either. There's just a lot of things done right about it that will future-proof a lot of what's happening here, whether everybody's using VS Code next year, or whether they've decided to shift to the non-Microsoft open source version of it. Or I think Eclipse just announced last week they've got an open source thing that they're now pushing as competition towards it. You know, the way that people are structuring these editors and these applications and setting the protocols, whether it's REST or that DAP for debugging, they're these like universally industry-wide agreed upon implementations that are going to make everything real portable and accessible, and it cleans all this stuff up so nicely.
Well, just thinking of when you're extending it to applications, when you've done your own set of little routines, say for if you're doing an application which includes the customers and actually having those sort of objects, you can kind of, if you can extend it to your own application as well, you kind of got that inbuilt help you can actually extend the inbuilt help from just being about how the programs work to how the other parts of your package can then all link in, and if you then can diversify who actually can code it.
That was
Right.
one of the original goals when we started this this whole project, was to have some of this be
So I'm just catching up then.
site driven, right? So a particular site could have a way to enforce particular coding styles, have custom snippets, documentation for their own subroutines or their own variables. So that was all on the table when we started. We really haven't quite got there yet, but it's pretty cool.
There's, we're about 10 minutes over here. We want to keep ourselves available to you if there's any, questions or people have some thoughts on direction. Consider this, it's a fireside chat at the end of the day, although I don't have a fire going, right? But pop on the video if you're comfortable. Give us a shout. Let us know what you're thinking.
Another question I've just raised in the chat. Is there any plans to integrate this? We do a lot of C# work. So C# and we use the OpenQM and QM client API to interface with the server. Is there any plans, or is it even possible to have a EF core custom provider, a QM provider for Entity Framework Core? So we can actually map it to objects. Has that been looked at any point, or has it been considered?
Interesting. I don't know how much it's been discussed so far, but I like the thought process. You shouldn't have too much issue marrying up your usage of the QM client library stuff in here with, if you start to bring your pick basic stuff into scope here too and centralize everything around VS Code. I've done a lot of .NET Core stuff with C# using VS Code. It does struggle with older versions of the .NET framework. I think if you're on anything under 4.6, you have to start bending over backwards to try to get things up and running. So, if we were to do any further customization for the QM client library stuff towards EF, it would probably be very platform specific and targeted, and would probably skew towards where .NET is going in general.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
I like where you're going with it.
Yeah, and the other, not related to this extension, I've been talking to Patrick Payne just before Christmas on containerization. I know there's a JBASE Docker image out there at the minute, and I have been playing around with stuff. I actually managed to get OpenQM running in a Docker container, Linux container, working through AccuTerm. It's a bit clumsy, but it kind of works. So I just wonder if there's any update on the direction of containerization, because obviously that's one of the big things in the market at the minute. A lot of stuff's going towards Docker and.
Yeah. Look for us to continue to improve all of that. Usually, I didn't run my demo off a Docker image today, but I do have containers spun up locally using Ubuntu and CentOS 7 and some other flavors of Linux that I rolled JBASE on right now. I don't have any QM examples I could point you to, but it is a thing we're working on standardizing further, not just for end users, so to give you images in the Docker Hub that you could run with to get up and going with a new environment, but also internally for our own development purposes, just to standardize some of that and reduce the reliance. Like Pete right now for his stuff is remote connected into stuff in our headquarters, and like in VMs there. And what we're driving is pushing that outward so that he could just be talking to a Docker container he's got sitting on his system. So JBASE is probably ahead of the curve there between the two products right now. That's where we've been putting a lot of time and effort and energy, but we want to bring all the same things to QM too.
Yeah, that's the main reason I run most of the stuff in containers. I don't like installing all the crap on my machine.
Rightfully so. Yeah. Patrick is working right now on containers that include the conversion utilities too. So there's a big focus on shoring up the net new experience when you're moving from a different flavor over to a QM or to JBASE, for us to provide an image that included not just the system, but also the tooling to help you streamline the conversion process. That's been a big area of focus. So I would expect to see a lot more coming from us just related to Docker this year, but that should give you a sense as far as how we're kind of prioritizing that work.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Do you guys have like some kind of newsletter that goes out, like a feed that I can follow so I know what's going on and what's being worked on? Is that something you have out there at the minute, or is it something that's being considered?
Not that's technically geared, but I like the idea. We should standardize a monthly tech update.
Yeah, I like the direction where stuff's going, so maybe I can provide input and.
Exactly what I was going to say. We out here sit here and use the things all day long. It would be nice to actually feed some sort of feedback in to say, look, like simple things might just be a way forward, which could sort a few issues out.
Definitely. We're pushing towards that openness too. I like the idea of a newsletter, but I'll dig into it as a specific example, right? We talked about how the extension is open source on the VS Code side, but we're in the middle of open sourcing our documentation too. And that's all moving to GitHub, and we're rolling a new portal surrounding that. So you're going to see this opportunity for feedback and contribution from the community and just this feedback loops kind of all over the place in the same way for some core Zumasys stuff, and I don't see us stopping there. I mean, my dream is to have by the end of the decade, an open source offering for one of the systems too, if not both. So we're going to keep churning in that direction. Let's open things up.
I'm guessing by the tapping on the microphone, somebody else wants to chime in. Anybody else got any feedback for us or commentary?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, yeah, this is Joe Acevedo from ATEC. How you doing?
Joe, it's been like 100 years. Good to hear.
Oh, my wife and I are up in Alaska right now. It's great to see you. Well, anyway, we got a question. We got a lot of questions. And anyway, Rocket has been pushing Python recently, and we want to know, we're interested in learning Python. What are you guys' feelings about that? And will you include Python in future versions of this?
So the Python stuff doesn't necessarily tie directly into the MV Basic thing, but like using JBASE as an example, it's possible to tie Python into your JBASE code already. So if you thought about having a JBASE environment where you've got some PIC basic code and you've got some Python code, and maybe you wanted to centralize source control in Git and then connect into that and use this connector, this would help you speak towards the PIC bits of it. There's already a Python extension for VS Code that's going to unlock everything you need for dealing with the Python code in that environment. So I'd say JBASE is kind of already there. There's a thing we haven't really quite advertised yet, but it piggybacks off of the PIC MultiValue group that we've got involvement in. Is there's actually an organization on GitHub now called PIC MultiValue that really pairs up with that as an opportunity for, if you're in the community space and you have a thing that you'd like to contribute as maybe an open source deal. The idea is that organization being open becomes a place for people to bring their projects and add them as repos and kind of have a centralized home. And I mention it because there's a JBASE connector for Python example project out in that organization space right now. Okay. So if you were going to look at using JBASE and Python together more closely, that's probably the best place to start.
Great.
Joe, I would love to catch up with you offline sometime. I'm not sure Alaska's ready for you.
Great. Well, yeah, definitely. We've done very heavy work with the GUI recently. We even used a web control to display graphics in GUI now. You know,
Cool.
like bar charts, line charts, and so forth. So
Yep.
we've really expanded on that. So we're really interested in this new web version of it. The earlier you guys could come out with it, that would be great.
We're working hard on it.
It's on the list, man. Yep.
Great. Well, thanks. Good to hear you guys. Stay safe, everybody.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah, Joe, if you've got, you know the web tools that you were talking about and putting them in a web space within inside the GUI side. So what are you doing? You're actually generating sort of graphics as
right. We write the
HTML type thing.
Right. We write the JavaScript and jQuery. We build it up and then we push the code into the web container and then it displays the graphic or the barcode or the charts or whatever.
Right.
So we're kind of pushing it to the limits. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, at the moment, what I'm ending up doing is because I tend to use Dev Express for a lot of that type of work for business intelligence type tools and being able to flush down sort of transactional information and actually blow down levels.
Right.
But what I have to do is actually almost like export it to SQL, and then I can actually import it into a graphics tool, which allows me to explode it down.
Oh,
What I'd ideally like to be able to do is find a data source type object, which I can just feed straight into the Visual Studio side, at which point then it'll all link and sync up together. So I'm sort of,
can you do that using ODBC?
ODBC for OpenQM, you can, but it's not a quick interface.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can sort of kind of do sort of some of the bits and pieces with ODBC, but you're kind of looking like for a proper query structure inside it, or being able to actually go and get a proper set of data to then use that data source types objects can actually then handle with inside of Visual Studio. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Hey, to jump in real quick, guys. I just want to thank everybody for showing up and giving us the time and attention today. This is a thing we're really excited about. So we hope you guys are too. We hope everybody walks away looking forward to checking it out if you haven't already. Again, be aware that we will ship some updates early next week for both the connector and the extension. And yeah, we'd love to hear your feedback. Support at zumasys.com if it's AccuTerm related. If you've got extension stuff, go ahead, make sure you're registered for GitHub, hop on and chime in there on the community and that repository. We'd love to have everyone, right? So there's no secret committee or clandestine sort of group here. This is the community's thing. So, we love it. Get involved.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, really. Thanks a lot.
Will do.
Okay. All right.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're
Talk to you
right.
later.
Bye.